so we'll go ahead and get started. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Dr. Lise Lafferty, and I work at the Center for Social Research and Health. I'm a senior research fellow. And so just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So I'm going to ask everyone to put your mics on mute, and you can turn them back on later during the Q&A to ask questions, and you can use the chat feature throughout and during the Q&A at the end to ask any questions as well. And just to note that this session is recorded. You'll see that up on the upper left. So please be mindful that anything that you put into the chat box may also be recorded. So I'd like to welcome everyone here today to the CSRH seminar series, and I'd like to get started by acknowledging that we're conducting the seminar on the unceded lands of the Bidjigal people, the lands in which the UNSW Kensington campus stands, and where I am also sitting today working from home. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. You may also want to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander owners of the land you are currently on, given that you may and probably are located elsewhere. So feel free to pop that into the chat. So today we have the very special privilege of hearing from Dr. Sarah White, who will be talking to us about telehealth in practicing using conversation analysis. And I feel like most of us would have used telehealth at some stage over the last 2 years. So we should all be somewhat familiar with this topic. Dr. Sarah White is a senior lecturer at the Center for Social Impact at UNSW. She is a conversation analyst and qualitative health researcher and has worked in clinical communication and safety and quality research, teaching, and policy for over 15 years. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm now going to hand over to Sarah.
Well, thank you very much. Very excited to be able to present today and to take up your Wednesday afternoon. Hopefully you've got a cup of tea and a biscuit and ready to chat. I can't share my screen. Are you able to enable sharing?
I should be able to. And I'm going to get you to help with this because I feel like that's not going to work for me.
That's all right. I'll start talking. My first slide is just the title.
Yeah, wait, you should be able to now.
Yay. Okay. All right, here we go.
Okay.
As I said, it's just the title. It's just what I'm talking about today. Yes. So I'm from the Center for Social Impact, which is actually in the business school. And I teach around change and user design and things like that. But I still get to research aspects around communication healthcare, including telehealth. And I've been working in telehealth not that long, but certainly in clinical communication for quite some time. So today I'll talk a bit about conversation analysis and clinical interactions. I'm going to take the position that you know nothing about conversation analysis, and I know that that's not necessarily going to be true for you. But I think that might be the easiest starting point with such a large group, is just to assume you don't know anything. But certainly I know that some of you or many of you may be familiar with conversation analysis or ethnomethodology or some of the kind of sociological background to it, or maybe other related methods. But let's just assume you don't. And I'll talk about how it's been used to understand clinical interactions. I'm not going to do a big methods tutorial at all. I'm really going to talk about how it's been used so far. I'm then going to talk about a little bit about telehealth in the COVID era. I don't know if we're allowed to call it that yet, but I feel like COVID era, we're not post-COVID. So let's just leave it at that. Then I'm going to take you through 2 projects. The idea being that I want to show you how I've used conversation analysis in these projects. One's telehealth in specialist care, and that project's basically completed. So I'll give you a nice sense of how I used it there. And then also talk just a little bit about the project I'm currently working on in general practice. And then I want to talk a little bit, kind of bring it back more broadly to conversation analysis and clinical interactions by looking at translation to practice to round it out. I'm happy to have questions, but it might be easier if we do them at the end, because I will sidetrack, tangent into long answers, so it's for your own safety. So please take a note of them, put them in the chat, save them for the end, if that's okay, so I don't lose track of time. All right, so conversation analysis and clinical interactions. Let's start with what is conversation analysis. It's analyzing conversations, but it kind of is what it says, but we can be a bit more specific. So conversation analysis is concerned with the structural and sequential organization of naturally occurring interactions. Okay, so what I mean by that is conversation analysis looks at how we get things done through interaction. In terms of structure, we're looking at things like, how do you get the floor? How do you get to take a turn? How do you deal with when a plane flies over and you need to ask someone to repeat it? How is it structurally organized? How does silence work? All those kinds of aspects. And one of the most kind of famous papers around structure is the turn-taking paper you might be familiar with, which is being very highly cited about how people take turns in conversation. And then there's the sequential organization. So by that, it's how one thing impacts the next thing that's going to be said. Yeah, so it creates what we call a local context for the next thing that's going to be said. So if I ask a question, chances are, well, what I'm asking is for you to answer. And I'm asking you to give a specific kind of answer. Now, we can do lots of things to get out of those kind of answers. So if I ask you a yes/no question, you don't have to say yes or no. You can say, well, actually, and you've already told me that you're not going to say yes or no. You're going to give me a longer answer. So we can do things, but it's designed, that's what we're looking at, is that sequential organization, how one thing gets another thing in terms of an action. And we look at naturally occurring interactions. So that is recording ordinary things. That doesn't mean it's just everyday conversation, obviously, because we're talking about clinical interactions. We could record this presentation and we could look at how turn-taking is managed. I mean, it's a presentation, so turn-taking is, I get to have the floor for a really long time. That's kind of it. But it's about something that occurs naturally. It's not simulated or role-played. You can look at simulation and role-play, but you're looking at it as a different activity. You're not making a claim that that's what happens in normal conversation. You'd have to make a claim about that's what happens in simulations. So yeah, we're looking at things that happen normally, ordinarily, naturally. The next half of my definition of conversation analysis is that it allows for the understanding of intersubjectivity through an examination of the normative expectations of participants. So what that is about is that it allows us to be able to see how people make sense of each other. How do we make sense of each other? How do we know that we're on the same page when we're talking? How do we know how we do that interactionally? And we can, as analysts, see that through the way in which a participant responds to something. And that's what we focus on in our analysis, is what the participants are orienting to. We're not what we think is going on. We're not trying to get into their heads. That's not what conversation analysis is trying to do. We're trying to see what's the observable actions that people are doing in their interactions. What norms are they orienting to in that? Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. But that's kind of conversation analysis in a nutshell. So conversation analysis actually started out in an institutional setting. It was done, Suicide Prevention Hotlines was the first kind of work in it by Harvey Sachs in the 60s. It developed in ordinary, mundane conversation for a while as well, but there's always been these streams of kind of institutional studies of institutional interaction. And so clinical interaction has been one of those areas of focus. And a few years ago, researcher Rebecca Barnes did a really nice summary of the different types, kind of categorizing the different types of studies that use conversation analysis for medical consultations. And these kind of studies are also found in other clinical interaction studies, like in physio and things like that. But hers was focused on medical. But what she found were institutional applied studies. So there are three types. One's institutional applied studies. So that's things like developing codes. So we're looking at recorded interactions, but we're not doing deductive coding. We are developing inductive codes. So it might be like, if you're looking at how a consultation opens, you can see there are inductively through that kind of analysis, you can see there are 3 different ways, for example, that a consultation is opened. So then you can kind of start coding from that. There's comparing to guidelines. So that might be like, well, the guideline says that this is what you should do when you break bad news, but actually what happens in practice? So they're institutional applied studies. Then there are observational relational studies. So these are often mixed methods studies. So that's things like you want to look at the interaction, but then how does that interaction, can you see something that happens in the interaction that impacts patient satisfaction? So you need an external measure for patient satisfaction, like a survey, interview, or something like that. So they're often the kinds of observational relational studies. And there's also intervention evaluations. So you do your traditional pre and post, you've got the intervention in the middle. And one of the ways to do that is you analyze the pre, create an intervention based on that analysis, and then do the intervention and then evaluate it with post recordings. Or you can do the pre recordings, put an intervention in from somewhere else, and then evaluate whether that worked as well. And then there's causal studies. So that's your randomized controlled trials, which there aren't many of, but certainly are possible once you've done that earlier work. So a lot of this work, it's just like other kinds of, it's kind of like a bit of, you've got your benchtop science that and you move on to your mouse models and all that kind of stuff in biomedical sciences. So it's similar to that in terms of like you go from this very granular analysis of interaction and building studies through them. Okay. And I'll have all the references at the end of the slides so you can see them. So I'm going to give you an example of each of these. 2 of them will be mine because I know them, and then 1, because I've never done a causal study, will be someone else's. So this was from my PhD. I'll hide that so you don't get overwhelmed. This is from my PhD, which was on surgeon-patient consultations. And what we were looking at there was how they were structured and how that was different from primary care consultations. And what we found through that was that referred visits opened a little bit differently from a primary care visit. So in a primary care visit, you can go see a doctor about anything. Basically, the doctor might have a sense of maybe why you're there, but you could basically talk about anything. But if you're seeing a surgeon, you're going for a particular thing, partly because if you're going to a shoulder surgeon, you're not going to be asking about, your gallbladder. Also, you have a referral letter. So what you have then is a different amount of knowledge that the doctor has. So when you're seeing a GP, the knowledge that the doctor has, they know you, but they don't know why you're there. So there's a bigger epistemic distance. But when you have a referral letter, suddenly that epistemic distance is much smaller because you've had the doctor's had the information, surgeons had the information from your doctor, referring doctor, about you. So they already know that you're there to see them. And that can differ. That could be, thank you for seeing Sarah for review and management, or it can be thank you for seeing Sarah for X, Y, and Z with more detail. But because of this difference in knowledge, the consultation opens a little bit differently because that needs to be acknowledged. So in the 2 cases in the 30-something consultations I had, where the doctor said, "What's brought you in today?" the patient didn't give a problem presentation. They said something like, "I want to get my hip fixed." Well, they did say, or because of the letter. They were the 2 responses. But for the most part, something like this happened. So we've got, "How's things? I got a letter from my colleague, Mr. Sampson, write to me, say you've been having trouble with volvulus or twisting of the bowel." So here the doctor is saying, "I already know some stuff about you. This is kind of what I know about you." And it also is a space to have agreement about this. Is this why you're here? This is why I've been told you're here. Is this correct? There's also that element of correcting or ensuring it's correct. And often, this doctor actually goes into ask about the patient, so kind of a bit more of a social history, but often it would then go into, "Could you tell me about your problem in your own words," or something like that. Oh, sorry. So this is an example of an institutional applied study. What we did is looked at the different ways in which these consultations could be structured, the different ways this, what we call the referral recognition sequence, could be used by surgeons. As an aside, I'll just quickly go through transcription a little bit. You can see the conversation analysis transcripts are a little bit different from other transcripts. They're very detailed. So the idea with this is that there's nothing we can dismiss as being accidental or disorderly. We don't want to assume that a 0.6 pause, point down is an accident. We don't want to assume it's processing time because we don't have access to people's brains. And as a participant in those interactions, you also make, you make an assumption, I guess, and you work off that to kind of build your next turn. So you're interpreting it. So we want to see what that person's interpretation is of what that space means. So we're not trying to interpret it for them post hoc. We are seeing what they did with it, I guess. And so we've got a lot of detail in the transcription. And there's other aspects. So we've got the pauses to tens of seconds. We've got talk that's quieter. We've got overlaps. Yeah, we've got fast talking. We've got things we couldn't hear properly and had a best guess. That's the brackets. We've got stress patterns. We've got pitch movement. We've got when there's no gap between the speaker, like this sounds like yeah, yep, yeah, like there's no gap. We've got a lot of things going on that we put into the transcript. So that really helps us with, as I said, not dismissing things, but also seeing that, particularly the sequential organization. So if you didn't have where they were overlapped, you might not know how overlapped it was. So was it a problematic overlap? Did it mean that the other person couldn't hear? Like, were they talking over each other for a longer period of time? So was there an issue with hearing that could possibly be why something else happened in the interaction, why something was repeated, for example? So we have all that detail so we can do, because we are looking at structure and sequential organization, we need that detail for that. That's an aside on transcription. It takes a while, not to scare you, but it does. It's okay. It's okay. It's totally manageable. It's totally worth it. So here's an observational relational study. As I said, there can be ones which is the mixed methods kind of stuff, which I've done, actually working on a few of those, but let's look at something I've actually had published. So this one was one of those pre and post intervention evaluations. And there was a trainee surgeon who was having a problem with communication, and someone said, go talk to Sarah, she'll help you. And I was like, okay. So I said, hey, are you happy if I study you? And he's like, whatever. So I did. It was all ethics approved. He was fine. It was very good. He was on board. That sounds like, anyway, it was all good. Everything's fine. So I recorded him doing ward rounds, and I found fairly quickly there were things he was doing really inconsistently. So sometimes he'd do, he was, say, asking the patient how they were. He'd sometimes say, how are you? And the patient would say, good. But sometimes he'd say, how are you feeling today? And the patient would say, I'm not feeling great. It's been really sore. So he's getting way more information when he said it differently. And he was also using technical language, and sometimes he was explaining it, sometimes he wasn't. And then the third thing was actually something he did very consistently, which is he's very tall and he would stand over the patients who are lying in bed. These are ward rounds, they're in a hospital. That was actually something he'd previously been given feedback on. I couldn't find really an interactional problem with it. There was no impact on the interaction that I could see, but he did do it fairly consistently. So what I did is I ran a little workshop, just him and me, and I showed him. I used this method called conversation analytic role play method, and I showed him the times he did it well. And I didn't tell him what it was. I made him figure it out, but and made him kind of participate in the analysis. And then two of those three things, I recorded a month later, two of those three things he had was very consistently doing, how are you feeling today? And then if he used technical language, he was then explaining it. He still stood over his patients. So I thought that was interesting that potentially the one that didn't have that kind of clear interactional evidence for him as well, someone doing that workshop, it was less convincing for him, I guess, to make that change. So that's an observational relational study. Oh, sorry, I had more information about it. This was just what I said, basically. The causal study, if you've seen me present before, if you follow me on Twitter, I'm sure you've seen this. Even if you don't, you may have seen it as well. So this is commonly referred to as the SUM-ANY study. So what the researchers did here was take something we know about conversation. So we know that SUM is more likely to get a yes response, and ANY is more likely to get a no response. So if you say, do you have some other concerns? more likely to guess. Any other concerns, more likely to have a no. This is important. So when in primary care, there's often this issue of what's called unmet concerns. So the patient comes in, you deal with their problem, and then you're about to leave, about to wrap up, and they said, oh, actually, I'd like to ask you about something else. So the idea here is trying to get clinicians to ask upfront, it's called upfront agenda setting. What else? Why else are you here today? In ordinary conversation, we often say, do you have any questions? And that's because we're trying to save the other person's face, trying to make sure that they don't feel pressured into answering. So it's the more polite way of doing it. But that's really counterproductive in a medical consultation when you want the person to tell you more things. So what they did is they trained 2 groups of doctors, one group to say, do you have any other concerns? And one, do you have some other concerns? For the consultation, they gave the patients a survey and got them to list why they were there. So multiple concerns. So of the patients that had multiple concerns that were asked, is there something else you want to address in the visit today? 90% of them, 90.3, shared those additional concerns. But if they were asked if there's anything else you want to address in the visit today, it's right up at the front. They've just filled in a survey listing why they were there to the researchers, and the 53% said yes. So it's a fairly big difference between the sum and the any. So that's one of those causal studies. Just looking at the time, making sure I'm staying on time. So here's a few examples. There's been a lot of CA work in clinical interactions, a lot. So there's been descriptions of consultation structures and the activities in those. So Jeffrey Robertson, primary care, myself for surgical consultations. There's been quite a bit of work around how patients resist treatment recommendations. A lot of this was, so Tanya Stiver's work really kind of started that off. And there's been some more recent work around that. So how is it done interactionally? Because often patients don't say, no, I don't want that treatment. They'll do things like be quiet. They won't reply. And that forces the doctor to talk more, forces them to either go and explain more or, modify their treatment recommendation. And you can see that happening. I'm doing very small things that actually make a difference without being confrontational or seen as confrontational. There's things around like how obesity is discussed and interventions for improving, and that kind of discussion in primary care, how that can be done and managed effectively. And then there's a lot of other stuff, but then there's a really interesting bit, which is called diagnostic conversation analysis. So what this is looking at differences in the way in which a problem is presented, a clinical problem is presented by the patient, and how it relates to different diagnoses. So this has been done in epileptic versus non-epileptic seizures, and then also in dementia care as well. And so what it is that they were able to see differences in the way in which people with epileptic and non-epileptic seizures presented the problems, for example. They're able to develop kind of linguistic profiles. So if someone has this, they're more likely to present their problem in this way. If someone has that in another way. They were able to give those to linguists who didn't know anything about seizures and say, here's the recordings or transcripts. Which one do you think they have based on these linguistic profiles only? And at a really high accuracy rate. I can't remember the percentage. I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm not great with numbers. So they were able to have a fairly good rate of diagnosis based on linguistic profiles. So there's some really interesting stuff that can be done. All right, I'm gonna have some water. I think I'm doing okay on time, actually. I didn't go off tangent too much. So let me do it here. So telehealth in the COVID era. It's been used and studied for a really long time. So I'm going to acknowledge that. There's been a lot of research that's happened in telehealth, particularly in Australia. And that's because we've had telehealth for a really long time, over 100 years. Obviously, with our, distance in Australia, there's been a lot of telehealth and need for it. And there's some really good research that comes out of places like the Centre for Online Health at UQ and AIHI at Macquarie and a few other places as well. That said, there's less than 30 published papers that are on telehealth that use conversation analysis. Obviously, there are other ways of looking at telehealth, but there aren't many that use kind of inductive observational methods to look at the interaction. So not just conversation analysis. I don't think there's many using other things like discourse analysis either. And all of those were published just in the last 17 years. And in fact, most of them even more recently than that. There's been a really swift and very broad increase, I don't have to tell you this, use in telehealth since early 2020. We know this. And so that's people using telehealth. You might have had a call from your doctor before. You might have been on the phone. You've been given some information, test results, something on the phone. Chances are you haven't had a mental health plan review, right? But those kind of things are happening now. So it is, the clinical implications are, and use of telehealth is far broader than it used to be. And so both patients and clinicians are probably less familiar with doing so much of healthcare over the phone or via video call. There's going to be exceptions, so people who routinely do that kind of work in terms of, in rural and remote areas. But for the most part, there's a lot of additional tasks that are being done that wouldn't usually be done. And so what conversation analysis can bring to that is examining how the participants orient to the different norms, interactional norms, and some that could be competing. So I talked before about the sum-any. So the any is the kind of interactional norm for an ordinary conversation, but that's going to be counterproductive in a clinical one when you want to get more information. And so there could be other competing interactional norms between, say, a face-to-face consultation and a telephone consultation or a video consultation, but also between how you usually use the telephone for other things and then how you use the telephone for telehealth. So you've got looking at how those kind of different potentially competing norms kind of interact with each other and potentially create issues interactionally in these telephone calls or video calls. Although I will say it's predominantly telephone, even though there's been incentives to do video through Medicare numbers, been a lot of phone calls. I'm just double checking the chat. Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to talk about my collaborators, of course. So the first project I said I'm going to talk about two. The first one around specialist care was with John Cartmill, who's a colorectal surgeon at Macquarie, and who's very he's basically a linguist as well. He's got a very good interest and experience in working with different linguists to understand communication. And then also Amy Nguyen, who's at the Institute of Health Innovation at Macquarie as well. So I'll explain that study in a bit. So they were the original team. So John contacted, Amy and I had met and started talking about doing a project together. And then John contacted me. We've worked a lot together and said, hey, we should do something on telehealth. And I'm like, yeah, actually there's this person. Anyway, so that's how that started. That project was on coming to an end-ish, and we then got in contact with Simon Wilcock from the GP clinic there, and as well as Peter Roger, who's a linguist at Macquarie, to put together a grant for the Avant Foundation, which we were awarded, and then we brought Tim C and Sarah Hayden on board as well for that project. So they're part of the Telehealth and General Practice project, which is, as I said, funded by the Avant Foundation. All right. So I'm going to talk kind of more broadly about how it's, because they're fairly similar in how we've approached them. And this approach is basically the approach for conversation analysis, particularly in institutional interactions. It's a fairly similar process the way through. So the first thing is collaboration. I've learned this the hard way. I've kind of post hoc collaborated, tried to, not failed. So the first bit is getting the clinicians, if you're working with clinicians, on board really early. It helps with, I suppose, situating and framing the work that you're doing and connecting with people. It's not necessary because we're looking at how participants are. We're not bringing in like our view into what we think is going on in their heads. So you can actually do conversation analysis without it. But when you're thinking about the clinical relevance of what you're doing or the practical implications of it, that collaboration is essential. So yeah, so start there. I think I've said that enough. Start there. Then it's getting the ethics, which depending on the ethics committee and your experience with writing for that and questions they have, it can take time. So assuming that's you've written your protocol, you've got your ethics, you've got your team, it's then doing some proto-analytic ethnography. So the idea here isn't to necessarily use the ethnography as data, but it is to understand how you'll be doing the recording. A little bit different in telehealth because often it's just like, well, particularly during COVID, it was like I dropped off the recorders and then I called them and said, do you know how to use it? And that was basically it. But it is looking at the space and figuring out, well, where is it that I'm going to provide consent? Where am I going to set up the camera? That kind of thing. So figuring out how the space works really, and how the research is going to be conducted within that space. Then it's collecting the data, naturally occurring interactions. So real telehealth consultations. And the way we did it was through, because it was mostly telephone calls, it was through a little audio recorder with a telephone jack, so they could still have the phone to their ear if that's how they usually used it. If they usually did speakerphone, it was just put on speaker. So we didn't want them to change the way they usually did work. Same is like video versus, because some of the doctors said, oh, do you want us to do video or audio? I'm like, whatever you normally do. We're trying to make this as naturalistic as possible. What is the normal thing? We don't want to interrupt your work. Just do your work as you normally do your work. Then it's transcribing the data, and there are different choices you can make around that, around how much data you transcribe in that CA detail, which is the Jeffersonian transcription. The way I tend to manage it is getting stuff transcribed strict verbatim. So you do get a bit of the sense of the sequential organization, and you get all those ums and ahs. And then based on kind of the initial analysis, then figuring out which bits get that higher level of transcription. That also allows, like I do that because, well, one of the reasons I do that is because doing that high level of transcription is part of the analytic process, because you're forced to listen to the same little bit of consultation over and over and over and over again. So you are getting very familiar with what's going on. You're hearing how it's working, how people are interacting. So, it does give that kind of bit of an analysis through it. Then it's analyzing the data. So with conversation analysis, there are a few different ways to go about it. So one is unmotivated looking. So that's the kind of thing where you're going, I'm just going to see what's going on. I kind of started referring to this as vibes. So, and we have a sense, because we do these kinds of interactions, of what seems odd, or what seems like why did I get a weird feeling about that? Why was that interesting? There was something about it. So it is that kind of sense of like, what's going on here? And sometimes that unmotivated looking is, hey, I've just watched a consultation or couple and they had this kind of thing too, and it worked differently here. Why is that happening? So you're not assuming, you're not necessarily asking a question like, I want to look at X. There's systematic analysis. So that refers to actually using what we already know about CA. So you might go, I've got these consultations, I'm going to look at how turn taking works. So we already know how turn taking works in mundane conversation, and also in some other institutional interactions. How does it work here? So you're kind of being a bit more directive in how you're doing. Then there's applied conversation analysis. Now, there's a few different ways of doing applied conversation analysis. I won't go into lots of detail there, but for the most part, it's this idea of having a more specific question. So it might be, I'm going to look at lifestyle talk. Yeah. So you're actually looking for something. You're not necessarily, you're not being too specific. It's still being fairly broad. One of the ideas with it is that you're not trying to limit too much, but you are, what something could potentially be lifestyle talk, for example, or pain talk. So that's the different approaches you can take, and you can take a mix of approaches as well, different points. Then it's building a collection. So if you're doing any of these, you're like, well, I'm going to, the unmotivated looking, it's kind of like, oh, I think that's interesting. We're going to collect instances of those across the data set. Systematic analysis, it's like, well, you started looking at turn taking, you found this interesting thing at turn taking. So you're like, I'm going to collect instances of those. With applied CA, you don't know if it's interesting yet, but you're going, I'm going to collect all the bits of lifestyle talk or potential lifestyle talk. And through that collection building, I'm going to refine the collection. I'm going to cast a really broad, wide net. Anything that could possibly be lifestyle talk, I'm going to put that in my collection to start with, and then I'm going to see the edges of the collection, because I'm going to go, well, that doesn't really fit because of this reason. And so you start seeing what lifestyle talk looks like in practice, rather than what we think it should look like, for example. So you build your collection, you've got your collection, and then you look at how you're going to present that analysis. So you can do what's called a single case analysis, and often it's more than one. But the idea is that it relies on this idea of order at all points. So because we are interacting together, there are norms that we're orienting to. If we stopped using those norms, we would stop making sense to each other. So if you've recorded an interaction, you can make claims about the norms that were governing that and what the people were orienting to in that. And that's kind of the single case analysis, is saying that, you know, this was a thing that happened, they made sense of each other, so we know that these are rules that were norms that were present during that. We can see orientation to that, or you can compare to other previous studies, things like that. The more examples you have, the more likely you are to be able to make broader claims about this is something that usually happens, rather than, so the kind of difference is this is something that can happen. This is a norm that can happen. You then moving to describing a practice of action. This is something that usually happens. So this is usually done like this interactionally. That's probably the simplest way of kind of describing the two, the difference between the two. And analyses can kind of live along a bit of a spectrum between those two, depending how much data you have, depending how many examples you have of that. And you can even get to the point of doing statistical analysis as well, depending how much data you have. Okay, well, that's the end of that. So that's kind of doing conversation analysis. And that's basically the approach we took for both, yeah, okay. So both the projects for the conversation analysis bit. Both of them had other methods involved as well. So for the one in specialist care, we wanted to look at what the interactional practices were in telehealth consultations, really in a very specific environment, which was specialist gastrointestinal clinic. And we wanted to compare what was known about face-to-face interaction. So we weren't comparing to interactions that we had, we were comparing to existing evidence around face-to-face interactions. And we wrote something about it. So we collected 15 consultations from 3 specialists and 14 patients. So that's 1 repeat patient. We did that unmotivated looking. So we weren't looking for anything in particular. We just wanted to see what was going on, if there was any difference. I will say unmotivated looking can be terrifying, because you're like, there may be nothing, like, well, there's always something of interest, but whether it's something that's actually going to impact clinical practice, I think, and that's the view I always want to have. It's why I do what I do. I want to make things better. So I think you can find things interesting as a conversation analyst, as we'll look at this thing, but, you know, is it something that's going to actually, you know, be beneficial is another question. We then did collection building of the target phenomenon. So the target phenomenon we ended up going with after that unmotivated looking was, we found a few things and we went with this. So there's other things we could go back and do more analysis on, but we're doing this other project now, so I don't know if that'll happen. But we looked at patient contributions to the agenda of the consultation. So remembering these are specialist consultations, they're often only there for one problem, but patients can contribute things like questions or other ideas and things like that. So how were the patients contributing to the agenda? That's what we wanted to look at. We did a highly detailed transcription of examples of that. And analyze those. So what we found was that, oh my gosh, time. Explicit opportunities were provided to the patient, were very uncommon. They weren't often asked, do you have any questions, basically. So we've got an example here. You can see lots of detail. But if we look here at line 7, you've got, do you have any other questions for me otherwise? So we already know, because I've already told you, any more likely to get a no. It also says other, even though there weren't other questions before, but it builds it like there was. No, I think you just, so what we've got here, sorry, before I read it out, you've got a pause. So do you have any other questions? We know it's more likely to get a no response, right? So there's this concept in conversation analysis of preference organization. So that's when I said that yes is more likely to get a, any is more likely to get a no, that's around preference organization. So a preferred response to an any question is no. And then, so a yes response is what's called dispreferred. And it's about interactionally dispreferred. It might not be socially dispreferred, but it's interactionally dispreferred. And so when something is dispreferred, there's extra interactional work that happens to show that you know that it's dispreferred. So they do a pause, for example. This is the patient pausing. And he actually answers the question in the preferred way. No, but he says no, fairly, no, close together. There's no pauses here. No, I think. So he's indicating he's actually going to say more. He's fairly safe here. There's no way the doctor could come in and say anything else here, because I think is not a complete, I think. There's clearly more coming. So, it's just, and then he asks a question. So while that is designed for a no answer, it does get a yes answer in that another question is asked. So that's one of the two examples of a patient being asked to contribute explicitly by the doctor to the agenda of the consultation. So then we've got patients, and you think, oh, well, could the patients bring up their own stuff? Yes, they could, which is really lovely. So if we had limited our collection building to when doctors initiated, we would have had 2 examples and that's it. But we went, no, we wanted to see any type of patient contribution to the agenda. So let's look more broadly. And so we looked at how patients initiated those. So for example, here, we're right near the end of the consultation. So we've got a pre-closing sequence. So we don't just go by. We do good to talk to you, whatever, like we do a little bit so we know we're coming to the close. If you want to say anything else, we're near the end. You need to say it now or forever hold your peace, kind of thing. So the usual response, when I talk about sequential organization, the usual response to a bye is a bye. So the patient here does not say bye. The patient says, Balmoral Hospital, Balmoral Hospital, will they ring me? So they're asking a question about the process, what the next steps are, some clarifying information. So they're able to contribute to the agenda right at the end of the consultation by asking a question. In this one, we've got one within the consultation a little bit more. So we've got the doctor here describing a diagnostic test. So often in surgeon patient consultations, it's not diagnosis and treatment recommendation, it's tentative diagnosis or a few different differential diagnoses or something described, but we need more information. So I'm going to send you off for a next step. So that's going to be a screening test or a diagnostic test of some kind. So this is what the doctor's doing here. So it's treatment recommendation, but it's not treatment. But it works like treatment recommendation in that it needs to be accepted for the consultation to move forward. And so there's silence here. So I was saying before about resistance to treatment recommendation can be silence. That's what we've got. And so the doctor starts saying something else, but the patient comes in, they basically simultaneously start. And the patient comes in with their own theory of illness, why they think they're experiencing symptoms, what they think could be going on. They're not questioning the authority, the epistemic authority or the diagnostic authority of the doctor. They really forcefully, but they ask any question that does, encroach on that, I suppose, epistemic domain of the doctor around, diagnosis. So but the patient does raise that, and you do get the doctor, if the doctor said it probably is, but kind of starts to pursue a bit more about patient understanding of what they're talking about. So this is how the patient contributed to the agenda within the consultation rather than right at the end. The last thing we found, so when we compared with the other studies that have looked at this, we found that patients tended to raise those additional concerns. Sorry, in the other studies, patients tended to raise additional concerns prior to physical examination. So that's where they found their opportunity. I'm going to ask my question that I've been sitting and I've got my question. I'm going to ask it right before physical examination. Telehealth doesn't have physical examinations. So these were often happening. That's one of the examples where it didn't, but the first of the 2 where the patient initiated was right at the end of the call. So we're in a space where, people are trying to get off the phone. It becomes a potentially really problematic space to bring up something new. And it may not be heard in the same way as a question earlier in a consultation will be heard, because it may be heard as doing something else rather than, being relevant to problem presentation or history taking. It may be heard as relevant to the kind of organization of what's occurring in terms of treatment, for example. So positioning where these things are occurring can impact it. I'm going to try and get faster because we're near the end. So the telehealth project, these are just the aims. This is the aims for the whole study. It's quite a large study with lots of different parts. And the main bit we're looking at, I'll talk through, is looking at interactional practices that are happening in telehealth. So similar kind of thing. What we said we'd do is different to what we're doing. So what we said we'd do is record 5 GPs, 6 patients each, and then we're going to try and track 1 patient per GP. So to get that sense of how care is done incrementally, because often that's missed in GP research, is that you look at one instance rather than, a period of time, which is more normal for the patient experience and doctor experience. And then some post-visit surveys. Sorry, that's my dog. So what we ended up doing was that none of the doctors that we recruited had patients that were regularly doing telehealth. So we switched to just recording consultations as one-offs. And we've got 42 so far. We're trying to get a bit more. We had a really poor survey response. So often when I do this, have done this kind of work, it's not been telehealth, so it's been in person. So I can get people right after their consultation and say, fill in this survey. Can't do that in telehealth, and people don't necessarily respond to their post-visit survey. So we're now doing a more general survey for patients that have used telehealth from one of the participating clinics. What we're doing is that unmotivated looking. We've found a few target phenomena, and we're doing that collection building. But also what we're doing is, because there's a group of us involved with different expertise and we've got interviews, we're using the thematic analysis of the interviews to identify aspects that would be of interest in the consultations. So how uncertainties, I can't actually remember what they're doing. I'm doing the CA bit. And so looking at what's happening kind of interactionally through a slightly different method. So that's kind of where we're up to on that. So we're going to keep doing that analysis. I'm so sorry for my dog. And continue doing interviews and surveys. And we're actually going to end up doing a co-design workshop around telehealth guidelines. So we're looking not just at a lot of guidance around telehealth is like, make sure you've got a private space, make sure the door is closed, make sure the fan is off, whatever, which is all important stuff. And then it says, conduct your patient-centered consultation as normal. But it doesn't really speak to the interactional challenges that there are in telehealth. So that's what we wanted to look at. Can we create guidance around that to help people, and potentially doing some workshops as well. All right. Oof, I am running over time. So translation to practice with CA has happened primarily through study design. So it's collaborating with clinicians, getting people involved. It's designing big and doing intervention studies. Designing to improve clinical care, like through that diagnostic CA, publishing in clinical journals, of course, sharing with communication healthcare experts, getting other people on board with doing this kind of work, and then doing things like training with, say, conversation and role play method, but there are other methods as well that people have used this kind of work to create training that is really based in interactional evidence. So one thing we don't do well in CA is collaborating with patients in the research team. We don't do it well at all. And it's something I think we need to do, people working in CA and clinical interactions. We're getting better at collaborating with clinicians, and I think we need to do it better with patients. We still need to improve that translation of research to practice, and thinking about the avenues that we use to kind of share what we know. I also think that we need to look at using CA in evaluation of research translation. So often we have bench to bedside research. Often that bedside research actually stops. So it might have perspectives around the interaction at the bedside, but it doesn't actually have what goes on at the bedside. And that's, I think, a really key bit that is missing. So if you've got a new medication that's being developed from the bench, you're at the bedside, you can get information about how people perceive those interactions, but you don't know what the learning curve is for explaining that, for a clinician who's new to the medication and the treatment, like how are they able to clearly articulate survival rates or whatever it is, or, side effects, something like that, without actually looking at what's going on. And so I think CA really needs to be a component of larger mixed methods and collaborative studies. I think it has a place doing its own thing and looking at that, but I think it would really be very valuable in those larger studies as well. I'll quickly, so for the people watching at home who look at it later, these are all the references, so you can go back and have a look. I don't know if the slides will get shared as well, but I'm happy for that. And what I don't have here actually is a paper I've just published, which is how to write a protocol with all the ethics considerations and methodological considerations for CA and clinical consultations research. So if you want that, I can send that. All right. Thank you for letting me talk longer than I was supposed to. Please ask me some questions.
That was excellent. Thank you, Sarah. We do have a question from Jack, and then I'm going to ask another one, I think, as a follow-on from Jack's as well. So Jack's question was, he's interested to know how conversational analysis understands or responds or was affected by issues related to cultural and linguistic diversity.
Yeah, that is a debated question, I think, in conversation analysis. There is certainly the view that you will see things happening as they occur in interaction. So we don't want to assume, one big thing in conversation analysis is you don't want to assume that something that's happening interactionally is because of an outside factor. It's really focused on what are the internal factors. So if someone has an accent that someone else doesn't understand, for example, they may ask them to repeat it. So you're seeing that. You don't necessarily know it's because of the accent unless they say, sorry, I didn't understand you because of your accent. But, you know, you can look at, you know, interaction, you'll see those things come up. There was a really good Twitter thread on this, which explains it way better than I am right now. But I know that there's work around this and making sure we're not ignoring it too much, because that's something I worry about is, are we dismissing some of these external factors a little too much in conversation analysis? And I think you could more systematically look at those kind of issues. Like certainly, well, there was one project which we didn't get funded around telehealth, which was looking at interpreting services, for example, in telehealth. And I would really want to engage properly with the community that was going to be focused on to understand these kind of diversity issues better.
Thank you. We have another question from Monica. I'm interested to know whether you've observed any linguistic phenomena that seem specific to the telehealth context. For example, what happens when the connection glitches or the phone line drops out, or when the doctor has to hang up on the video call and call back on the phone because the internet connection isn't strong enough. Yeah,
I haven't found that in the data that we've got. Certainly one of the things I'm collection building around is how people make sure that other people know they're still on the phone, which is something we do in every, like, you know how sometimes you go, wait, are you still there? Are you listening? I even had it here. I'm like, is everyone still there? I don't know. I'm just going to assume they can all hear me. I have talked with my mic off for a good minute before. So I did kind of check, is my mic on? Yeah, it's all good. But there is a really good paper by Soiren and friends called Whose Turn Is It Anyway? And it's about latency in calls. So that's that sense of that technical issue and how that impacts when people speak and when so that's really around the structural organization of how people know that they can take the floor. How do they know if there is a latency issue? So that might be something to look at.
Thank you. And then a question from Dr. Anne Lawless. When using the curiosity approach, and then there's hashtags, I don't know if I'm supposed to read them out, but what's here? Do you need to suspend your own biases in burning curiosity? And if so, how do you do that?
That's where it's really helpful to work in a team because it can, particularly, I think, if you've got experience in something, you might find something more interesting than other people, or be bringing that in. And working with clinicians, I sometimes see that. So they'll go, oh, that's what I usually do, or that's what I'm like, well, okay, well, let's look across the data. It's hard, but like a lot of conversation analysis is done collaboratively. A lot of papers are written up independently, you know, in traditional conversation analysis, but certainly everyone takes their data to data sessions and, you know, a group of people look at it together and talk about it. And I think that helps. With that, I think acknowledging biases is a big thing. So for the start of my thesis, I've got a page talking about my biases as someone who has a chronic health condition when I'm looking at medical interactions. So I think, you know, similar to a lot of other qualitative stuff.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Charlotte Smedley, who says that was so interesting. And I wonder if you have done any work with social workers or other allied health practitioners.
Not me, but I was looking at, I don't know why. I saw something on Twitter, I think someone was talking about social work, and I was like, I wonder if there's any CA work in social work. There is. but I have not done it. In terms of allied health, yes, I'm just thinking, I've got some physio data, but it wasn't CA that I did for that. But I'm now working on a paper around a healthy weight clinic, and we're looking at both the endocrinologist and dietitian. So it's a very small study about a single healthy weight clinic, but looking at how they manage resistance differently, and the impact that being a dietitian versus being a endocrinologist has on resistance to treatment recommendations. And the fact, the dietitian, it's lifestyle recommendations, so there's a more ability to resist and more ability to have an opinion because it's a shared epistemic domain rather than a endocrinologist, where they've got their biomedical epistemic domain that the patient can't encroach on as easily because they're not allowed. It's not their social role, I guess. So yes, a little bit.
I wanted to ask, and this kind of builds on Jack, or is like a separate sort of parallel question to Jack's question at the start. And so a lot of people on the call today, I am familiar or work within STI, HIV, hepatitis C space with key populations.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned earlier on about obesity, and I wondered if there were those nuances to consider based on the disease that was being talked about.
Yeah, so when looking at study design, there's, I suppose, there's risks and benefits, I guess, of doing more strategic sampling. Certainly if you're wanting, so I do some strategic sampling. When I started off, I was kind of like, yeah, collect whatever. But it makes it more difficult to make claims about what usually happens. And if I'm trying to make things better, often I'll need to do that. So I want to have more controlled populations, as it were, because it allows for that kind of analysis to happen. The risk with that is that you don't have sufficient diversity. And you obviously can't make any claims about, other populations in that case. So yeah, I mean, I certainly control. There's a lot of other people that do as well, control for that kind of, upper respiratory tract infections. There's, all that kind of stuff, people presenting with that. I've done a project on pain, which I'm finally writing up. And I didn't want them to know I was looking at pain, because I didn't want the doctor to ask about pain. So I didn't tell them. All ethics approved. I didn't tell them. And so it meant I collected 53 consultations, GP consultations, and only 24 of them are used for the analysis, because only 24 of them are about pain. So, it's making decisions like that to, making sure that you're not, I suppose, biasing the data that you're collecting, but also, yeah, you can control for populations like that. So for example, looking at how, obviously I've done surgery stuff, but maybe looking at how lifestyle talk is done in surgery consultations would be fairly different from how it's done in general practice, for example. So you'd probably want to be able to say that and see that in the explanations.
It's really fascinating work, and I think everyone was really quite in awe today listening. So thank you very much, Sarah. That was wonderful.
If you've got questions, please email me or follow me on Twitter. I'm always happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. I've got somebody has sent information to me to pass on to you, so I will do that after this.
Okay.
But thank you so much for your time today and for your wonderful presentation.
Thanks, everyone.